Without further ado, we have Alex Beloz, our winemaker, and from remote location, unbeknownst to anyone else, we have Peter Molnar, who's going to kick it off and speaking with us about elevation and soils.
Hey guys, good to see everybody, and welcome. So our kind of Mayacamas adventure started almost 20 years ago to the day when we really explored and found this absolutely amazing and somewhat remote abandoned walnut orchard that became Obsidian Ridge. And we learned a lot along the way. You know, I would say that in the beginning, I used to think that, and most of my work is taking care of the vineyards, but I used to think it was a 50-50 deal between the grower and the site. And Obsidian Ridge has changed my view on that. I think it's a 90% site and 10% the growers. We're basically there to get the fruit over the finish line clean and healthy to make good wine. So we're going to go through basically what seems like a pretty formal thing to have 3 separate bottles of wine, but this is a microcosm of what we at the winery have been looking at over the past 2 decades. And these trends that we noticed from the top to the bottom of the vineyard, and how they make really very different types of wine. So this whole thing started because we keep our barrel lots separate, and we taste through them all the way through the winter and into the next year. And after 18 months, Alex assembles them into our blend. And over the time, we said, well, these wines are actually really remarkably different sometimes. And we thought it'd be kind of cool to bottle them separately. So I think in 2008 was the first time that we did our elevation collection, and the wines in front of you are the second time we bottled them separately. So that's the background. And I'm going to jump into the work and the vineyard. So I put together some pictures for you guys because pictures are better than finger puppets on Zoom. So here we go. The elevation of wine, backstory. We basically got our hat handed to us up on that hill a couple times in the early years of farming. We took the best, we thought, of Napa Valley practices for high-end Cabernet and applied them to canopy and water and a bunch of different things. And basically 5 years into it, we had our Toto, we're not in Kansas moment, which is that this is really radically different to be farming at a half a mile in elevation and on such incredibly young volcanics. If you guys can see here up in the upper right there, that's Obsidian Ridge. It is the highest vineyard in the Mayacamas mountain range. It is in the northern part of the Mayacamas called the Alta Mayacamas. Mayacamas is the Native American term for howl of the mountain lion or home of the mountain lion, depending on the translation. So, so let's dig into how we found this and why we're talking about it tonight. So mountain wines are different fundamentally. Half a mile of elevation doesn't sound like a lot until you forget your hat. If I forget my hat at Poseidon Vineyard, which is down by Carneros, you know, I got a hot head. If you forget your hat for a day of farming up at Obsidian Ridge, you can get pretty sun-slapped. And those grapes are in that kind of climate all the time, from beginning to end of the season. So we have different soils up there, we have different climate, we have different sunlight, we have different UV as part of that sunlight, and we have a different ripening curve. And those are some of the things we'll touch on today. But let's just get down to the basics. This is Obsidian Ridge from the top. My brother Arpad and Michael there standing. And this was a picture taken at the very beginning of the season. As you can see, the plants are just budding out. And one thing I want to notice in the foreground is the height of the canes that are coming off of that vineyard. This is probably May, early June even in Obsidian. If you were in Napa at the same time, you would have canes that were 2-3 feet tall and canopies that look pretty aggressive. So this is what it looks like when it's fully in the middle of the summer. Canopies are out. And you can see from the top to the bottom of the vineyard here is 2,640 feet, exactly half a mile in elevation. And at the very bottom of the vineyard is 2,350 feet, which is only 300 feet difference. But you have a lot of topography there and a big hill in the middle of it. And that affects how the grape grows and how the grape matures. This is a picture of the new planting, Eli's Ridge, looking out to Mount Konocti. Mount Konocti is the dominant volcano in the area and is the source of all the the material and soil material in our vines. Besides being relatively high in elevation, we are on the youngest volcanic flow in Northern California. This area was still exploding 10,000 years ago, about 5,000 years after Native Americans first settled in the basin. So these are extremely young, extremely poor, extremely well-drained soils. And that combination with the elevation is really that gives you the signature stamp of Obsidian Ridge as a fruit. So this is Half Mile. So let's talk about elevation. What does elevation give you? Well, first of all, elevation gives you more dramatic climate. While this is a typical day, this is not a typical winter in North Coast, but this is a picture we took in 2008, April 3rd, 4th, it snowed about 1.5 feet. It snowed enough where we were able to ski down it. And so even though we are, as a crow flies, about 8 miles from the Alexander Valley and about 15 miles from the north part of Napa Valley, the climate here is very different. You have much more, much colder conditions, much lower humidity, bigger diurnal curves because of the humidity. Diurnal curves are the difference between the top and the bottom of the heat cycle in a day. And you have sometimes occasionally snow. This is an overview of the North Coast. And I put this in here because it's part of a very long research project that we've been privy to on the changing climate of the North Coast. But the point of the slide here and the picture is to show you that areas up on the hills here, and green, the edge of the green arrow is where Obsidian Ridge is located. Those are high up at 3,000 feet. And as the Central Valley of California heats up every day, it draws cold air in from the ocean. And that cold air basically scrapes off the heat from all of these hillsides. In the valleys, which is around Healdsburg and Dry Creek, or here, Napa Valley, or down in Sonoma, that cooling air doesn't get deep enough in the valleys to scrape that heat out. And that's a very big part of what makes Obsidian Ridge as unique as it is that even though we have abundant sunshine, we're at the same latitude as Morocco in Northern California, we have this cold Alaska current that comes along the coastline, basically pumping trillions of gallons of water down along our coastline at 50 degrees. That cools our whole North Coast. The way that that temperature gets drawn in over the North Coast depends on whether you are near the coast, whether you're near the bay because of fog, or whether you're up high, in the case of Obsidian Ridge. Some other climatic questions is also the local ones. In the background is Obsidian Ridge, the original planting. On the lower left is the bottom, which is called A block, which is 2,350 feet, and the upper right is H block, it's 2,640 feet. In the foreground are very big rocks. Some of the big obsidian that we pulled out in the new planting of Obsidian Ridge. That block right there is probably 6 feet tall and close to 4 tons. We pulled out close to 5,000 tons of obsidian. As you can see, every rock you see in the foreground is obsidian. It's all over, and it's one of the most unique growing sites that we know of. We don't know of another vineyard in the world actually that has this concentration of obsidian in the soils. But anyway, let's get back to climate for a second and elevation. The reason I show this slide is this is a fairly, it looks like a gentle slope, but it isn't. It's up to 25 degrees in aspect. But basically, cold air drops. And in this vineyard, the top of the vineyard is warmer than the bottom of the vineyard, it's colder. In the middle, we have an inversion that sets up. An inversion is when warm air sits on top of cold air, and we get that every year. The big issue here for us in terms of elevation, in terms of climate, is that the upper part of the vineyard buds out about a month before the bottom of the vineyard does. In mid-May, we start getting buds here, and it's, early May, late April, we'll get buds here, and a month later, we get buds in the bottom. That means that the whole vineyard goes through that lag of about a month throughout the whole growing season. To give you an example, we start picking the upper part of the vineyard in usually the 21st of September, the equinox, and we finish the bottom around Halloween or just before Halloween. So this difference of the top to the bottom is what we're going to be tasting today. It's not because of this huge difference in ultraviolet light between 2,350 feet and 2,640 feet. That's pretty minimal. But the temperature differences are very significant, and they give you a big difference in how the fruit tastes. And so a lot of what we'll talk about tonight is the difference between the upper block, H, the middle part, which is usually around C, D, and B here, and the lower part, which is A block. A lot of the fruit is the same rootstock, same clones, but you guys will taste in the difference that the only difference is there's no difference in farming. There's no difference in barrel usage. There's no difference really in winemaking and how we prepare the wines, but there is a big difference in the growing cycle. So I'll finish with the last sort of geeky slides because they're interesting. We have these really very sophisticated temperature monitors throughout the vineyard. And this is a graph of all the monitors from the top to the bottom of the vineyard over the course of the most critical part of the year, which is our harvest. And if you notice, the daytime temperatures are relatively the same. In this week, they were roughly around 80, 82. This is now the first week, as you can see, of October 5th to October 9th, I believe. This is the heart of our harvest season. This is when we bring in the most fruit. And one thing I just wanted to point out is even though the daytime temperatures are relatively the same, look at the difference between the nighttime temperatures. The upper part of the vineyard's at 60 degrees at night. The bottom part of the vineyard's at 38 degrees. That's a massive difference. And that's because of this inversion layer and because cold air slumps down to the bottom of the vineyard. The biggest effect is when the sun rises in the morning, take a look at how much longer it takes for this cold fruit down below to start warming up to the point where it starts to really metabolize and ripen. Meanwhile, this fruit at the top, it just sort of shifts right into ripening gear, probably 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning. This stuff down here, to get from 38 degrees to get up to 50, 55, 60 degrees when vines really start to work and respirate and metabolize, takes a long time. And that's what you're going to be tasting today. Really, this graph is a temperature, like a heartbeat monitor of the three wines in front of you, to put it, to use a simple analogy. So I'm going to finish with one more geeky slide on what we call the ripening curve. We got together our crack graphics team and we took out our Sharpies and we made this graph for you guys. It's actually a graph I used in a number of different explanations. Basically, this is the holy grail, to use a Monty Python skit analogy here for a second, but this is sort of the holy grail of fine winemaking. When we look at these, when we make picking decisions and we make winemaking decisions together as a team, basically we're looking at two major parameters. One is how sugar is accumulating, which is in the purple. The second one is how acid is dropping. And at some point when those things intersect where we want them to be, we have to pick. If we pick too early, we don't have enough sugar. If we pick too late, we have hot over-alcoholic wines. If we pick too early, the wines are too tight. If we pick too late, the wines are sort of flabby and don't have any discipline to them. So you have to pick here, really, if you want to make fine wines. The difference between picking here and picking here is whether your vineyard gets to 50 degrees at night or doesn't. All of the great wine regions of the world, whether it's Burgundy, whether it's extreme Sonoma coast, whether it's Bordeaux, whether it's Mendoza, whether it's any of the fine regions that we know of, most of the time, the single biggest commonality is for one reason or another, whether it's fog, whether it's northern latitude like British Columbia, or whether it's elevation, at nighttime, the vineyard dips below 50 degrees. Grapes don't metabolize under 50 degrees. It's basically like taking your whole vineyard and sticking it in the fridge and letting it rest and developing time overnight. So in the morning when the sun comes up, the fruit can ripen more slowly. And this difference between these two circles is a whole shooting match. If you have a cooler nighttime, you can let the sugars develop more slowly, the acids break down more slowly, and then you have this period in here which is where we get real phenological ripening. And by that, we mean the tannins can evolve, the color can develop, and we have all kinds of secondary and tertiary ripening effects in the fruit. And that's what really makes wine complex and interesting. And so we're very lucky at Obsidian Ridge because the elevation really gives us that. And I hope that these 3 wines that we'll taste tonight will give you an idea of how we try to build this wine and understand what this vineyard gives us. So enough. So there goes our super top secret Sharpie graph. I'm going to hand it back to you guys, and we'll get to tasting the wines.
How do the temperature changes relate to some of the Northwest?
Peter, we have a couple of questions that have come in through the chat that, if I may, I'll lob to you.
Yep.
If that's okay. So first was how have some of the temperature changes affected wines in the Northwest versus us in North Coast?
Northwest.
So I'm assuming that's directed specifically to the changes, meaning you mean climate change, I'm assuming, but diurnal shifts.
Diurnal shifts, yeah. So, okay, a couple things. One interesting concept is called the lapse rate. Every 1,000 feet you go up in elevation, it's the equivalent of going 300 miles towards your nearest pole, obviously for us, the North Pole. And so at 2,500 feet, our climate is pretty damn close to what Walla Walla is, because Walla Walla is about 600 miles north of us. So 2,500 feet is equivalent of 700 plus miles, puts us right on the border of British Columbia and Washington, theoretically. Now, there's a lot of other factors that change that. What Washington has is specifically their days get much shorter by the time they get to October, right? Their sun drops down, I don't know, 4:30, 5 o'clock. I mean, we still have sun into, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but basically you have a much shorter day and therefore a much cooler, longer night. So that's how elevation is similar to latitude in terms of creating those conditions where you can have those cool nights during the harvest period. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks.
Is Obsidian used for?
You mean, the Obsidian Ridge or Obsidian the rocks? Yeah. So I think we all have our own stories on this one, but someone's asked if Obsidian is used for anything beyond our growing fruit.
Well,
the rock itself.
It's very good at slashing our tires on our trucks. That I can tell you. But yes, this was actually the very top of Obsidian Ridge is a surveyed and registered archaeological site. It was probably being used by Native Americans for creating stone tools, typically not arrowheads, but gaming knives and so dressing game, and also hatchets. Every obsidian flow has its own molecular signature, and Lake County obsidian has been found all the way in the East Coast. They believe it was traded all the way across the country as late as 5,000 years ago. Today, yeah, people use obsidian for a bunch of different things. Very pure obsidian is still used for surgical tools. It's the sharpest material known that's natural. It sort of sharpens on the molecular level. It sloughs off, so it stays sharp. It's used for optical surgery and for plastic surgery. And also lots of decorative things. People use it for jewelry and those kinds of things. We've made very nice piles and walls. And if any of you would like to have some for your garden, please just bring your truck and we'll load it up for you because we have plenty of it. So.
How would you rate the skiing at Obsidian Ridge?
So the next question is, how would you rate the skiing at Obsidian Ridge? But I just want to interject that the first time that you told me that you skied down the vineyard, it was along with the story about almost taking your head off with one of the guide wires. So I know that it's not necessarily easy, but curious how you rate it.
Yeah, well, besides my dog and I almost taking each other out halfway down, there was one moment where the skiing part and the vineyard part didn't come together, and I skied down one of the rows, and these canes, they lignify during the winter and they become like pieces of little sticks. And I got one straight across my brow and my nose at speed. It was, that was very painful. But yes, I now have a very good pair of rock skis. The Obsidian literally took huge pieces of the base of the skis off. They were very old skis, but it was super fun to do. You know, I mean, you don't get to do that very often. And we don't get that much snow up there very often, but it was about 1.5 feet at the top. So enough to do it.
Enough that you were willing to ski down a hill of broken glass.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It was a good, it seemed like a good idea at the time.
Like most businesses. So thank you very much. Thanks to Peter Molnar for that education on our vineyard, as well as that relates to the wines that we're dealing with this evening. And next up would be Alex Beloz, our winemaker. Take it away, Alex.
Thanks, Douglas. And thanks everyone for joining us, our club members, friends, family even, I believe. Yeah, so I have been making wine for over 20 years now in California. I'm actually originally from the Midwest, but about 15 years ago, I met up with the Molnar brothers, and I was taken up to Obsidian Ridge to get a little sneak peek at the possibilities of growing grapes up there and making good wine. And I was just breathtaken really by what I saw and the opportunity to be part of something really new and exciting. It really felt like we were on the frontier of something new with grape growing and winemaking, such high altitude, and just got enthralled by all that after making wine down in the flats in Sonoma and Napa. Yeah, so every year we make a signature Cabernet Sauvignon called our Estate Blend, which I believe all of you are very familiar with. And in certain years we make wines from each elevation. Actually, as Peter pointed out earlier, we make these wines separately. We vinify them separately anyway, because as you know, the terrain at Obsidian is varied. Starts at about 2,400 foot elevation, goes all the way to 2,700 foot elevation. And that means that ripening doesn't happen all at the same time. That's really, really fortunate for us logistically, really, to be honest, because if we had all a flood of 100 acres of fruit coming in all at once, that would be a little frightening. But it really unfolds over the course of about 3 to 4 weeks. Really what happens is that steep slope between 2,400 foot and the 2,700 foot elevation, that slope area is what ripens first, usually around the 3rd week of September. And over the course of the next few weeks, we start harvesting into the lower parts, and then ultimately at the very highest part of the vineyard, H block. And what we found over the years is that site trumps everything, really. We have a few different clones up there of Cabernet. We even have some other odd varietals, but Cabernet up there is really dictated by the elevation because of all the things that Peter had mentioned. Temperature, mostly. As you know, heat rises and cold settles. Just like in your house, you know, the basement is always colder and the upstairs is always hotter, trying to regulate that temperature, but you can't in nature. So the steep slope is where during the day when it gets really warm, in the evenings, the winds come in from the Pacific Ocean, flush out the heat, and then the cold starts settling into that lower portion of the vineyard, A block, and also at the very top portion of the vineyard, H block. And so at about the 3rd week of September, we start harvesting the steep slope blocks C, D, and E, and sometimes F. And then we start moving into A block and H block. And then what happens is, what we found over the years was that each one of these wines from these different blocks has a character to it. And so we'll be tasting tonight the bottom, the middle, and the top, kind of as I told you. And the middle part is that steep slope. I'd like to start here because I feel like this is really the backbone of our estate blend. Once the three of these get combined to make the estate blend. But this is the wine that's made from the first picking off that slope. It's picked kind of at the peak of autumn when temperatures are really warm in California. And the grapes get really ripe. We are kind of at the, how would I say, we're at the extreme temperature there of heat. And so we're kind of rushing to get the fruit picked so that we can get the ultimate ripeness without getting overripe. So the wine ultimately ends up being one of our richest character wines. I feel like the wine is chocolatey, really soft, supple tannins, dense and concentrated, but almost like this sweetness as well. And that's really what ends up being the core of the base blend of our estate blend. And then if you wanted to move into the bottom part of the vineyard, that wine, because the grapes are down in the coolest part of the vineyard and bud out later, as Peter had mentioned, we're having to wait even more time for that to ripen. But on the contrary to the middle part of the vineyard, here we're up against another element towards the end of harvest, where we're up against the rains that come in late October and also frost. And so what we're doing is all you folks know about that famous wine phrase called hang time, is we're giving the grapes a lot more hang time down in that lower part to ripen more, so that we can get into the zone of making a fine wine. But it's also like a really stressful time of vintage. We've gotten most of the fruit in already, but we're waiting on this last part to come in. And that wine, its expression is so different than the middle. I mean, this wine is all about aromatics. It's all about acid, about tannin. It's a really edgy wine, I think. And only in certain years do we bottle it on its own. But it really does lend that certain character to our estate blend. It adds the tannin, it adds the color, and it's got sort of like a purple hue, a purple fruit character to it, whereas the middle is more of like a chocolatey kind of soft and yummy, chewy kind of wine. And then finally, we get to the top of the vineyard. Again, it's cooler up there. We have a smattering of different clones up there too. And we're also harvesting this towards the end of the season. And in some years, it's even been like the earliest part of November. This wine is just really interesting in that it's more of red fruit flavors. It's got a ton of spice. Douglas actually just mentioned that it was a lot of the cinnamon red hot kind of spice. And it's, I feel like it's almost a complete wine on its own. And in fact, sometimes this wine makes it into some of our reserve blends. I love this wine because of that. It just feels like a more elegant wine on its own. And just, yeah, just delicious. But we present these wines to you only in certain years when we think that, you know, it's a good learning example of how elevation translates to different flavor profiles in our Cabernet Sauvignons. And then they come together in the end to make more of a complete wine with our estate.
Yeah, can I ask a question?
Yeah, question.
Was there something special about 2017 that inspired us to do the elevation scale in only the second time in a decade?
Yeah, you know,
So we may need to repeat that question. The question was there something specific about 2017 that made these grapes worthy? Yeah.
Decide to do this. Not in particular. And I'll tell you that because of the way harvest unfolds, like I said earlier, we do vinify all these different blocks separately. So we have the opportunity to bottle up an elevation series almost any given year, because I don't start looking at the final blend until about 12 months out, when the wines really start opening up and showing their true expression. I mean, I've gotten used to this after making Obsidian for 15 years, but still, I like to keep lots separately, and then decide, what's going into certain bottlings, and then kind of putting together the blend. But because I keep them separate, we're able to do the elevation series almost any given year. 2017 was a specifically, particularly delicious year, very ripe year too, but just rich and really satisfying.
Another question. Is the three wines have very different aromatics. What's the linkage between the elevation and different aromas?
Yeah, so the question is, how does elevation translate to the aroma profile of the wines because they are very different? And I can't put my finger on exactly what it is that causes that. I have a feeling that it's about this hang time that we were talking. We have a limited amount of hang time with the slope of the vineyard. So it's very warm. A lot of these aromatics, because of the heat, get drawn off, and then we're left with more concentrated flavor. Whereas with the bottom and the very top of the vineyard, we're sort of dancing that line of how long can we leave this on the vine before it gets too cold to harvest? And I think that hang time is what's allowing the aroma compounds in the grapes to stay put. And that's probably the most logical answer I can give on that question.
Yeah, can I answer? Can I take a stab at that one, JJ? So if you think about it, sometimes picking Obsidian Ridge, it feels like farming 3 different vineyards. If this was all the same elevation at a flat zone, it would basically ripen all at the same time. It would go through the same ripening season. We have to remember that the ripening season actually is the whole year. So the amount of light and the amount of heat that happens in May versus June versus September changes with the sun and its aspect to the earth. These different zones of fruit, because they bud out a month apart, basically have 3 different experiences. They are going through 3 different summers. And that's what explains the evolution of these different compounds. Because what we do know is that the amount of light at certain times, or UV particularly, changes the character of different compounds in the grapes. A grape is constantly trying to adjust to its environment. The only reason it gets dark, by the way, is so historically and biologically, is so a bird would come and eat it, digest that seed, fly away and deposit that seed somewhere else, right? So the grape is constantly changing to its very small microclimates. And I think, to Alex's point, especially on A block, which is the coolest block by far, we have sometimes, some years, we have trouble ripening that all the way through. You end up having a much more aromatic wine, not because it has more aromas than the ones that are in the upper blocks, but because, and a lot of how we taste is a matrix effect, the fruit is more restrained. It's not as ripe, it's not as chocolatey, it's not as dominant. And so we sometimes feel those differences. So anyway, that's just one way of thinking about how, you can have a Cabernet from Santa Barbara, you can have a Cabernet from Napa, and you can have a Cabernet from Walla Walla. Right now, if you look at it climatically, we almost have those differences in some shape or form in the same vineyard, which is kind of cool, to be honest. It makes the wine interesting. And in a way, it creates what we call sometimes verticality in the wine. It's not just one characteristic from one block. You're tasting characteristics from essentially almost 3 different vineyards.
Thanks, Peter.
Yeah.
Oh, one more question.
They noticed that the middle seems to have harder tannins.
Middle, harder tannins. Yeah. Well, no doubt we are a mountain Cabernet Sauvignon producer. we don't shy away from tannin, or I should say the grapes don't shy away from tannin, actually. Because of that forest, rocky, steep slope that we're on, we do get a lot more skin to pulp ratio, which means that there's a lot more stuffing in the grapes, really a lot more of those phenolics, the tannin, the anthocyanin, the coloring compounds. There's a lot more of that skin to pulp, and also with the similar amount of seed as any other cluster out there. So that when we ferment those grapes and make wine out of them, we're easily getting a lot more concentration of flavor, which also translates, of course, to having more color and having more tannin. So probably has more to do with the vintage this year than other years, but yeah, it is a chewy wine, no doubt.
It's also interesting, if I may, that there's a lot of tannin in the bottom as well. It feels different on the palate.
It's a different kind of tannin.
Yeah, it's a greener.
Yeah, greener and a little bit, and I call it an edgy wine. The tannins are edgy, they're sharp, whereas the tannin in the middle is like chewy and thick.
Yeah, and I would say that fits for the bottom, because the bottom is a more savory, or sometimes I'll say vegetal. It feels like greener and savory, whereas the slope, the middle tannin feels, the fruit feels darker or more pronounced, and the tannins feel, as a result, sort of in contrast, a little drier, not as green. And so maybe that combination is what the question asker is feeling, because for me, I feel that like I'm more aware of the bottom tannin than the top feels sort of, in comparison, silky and elegant, as Alex said earlier, with more cherry fruit. Yeah. Not that you're asking, but I'm telling you anyway.
More red fruit. And this is probably a good time to tell you that with each one of these wines, because I knew I was going to be doing this elevation series for you guys for the kit, I kept winemaking as similar as possible in the cellar, and also vinified the wine, or aged the wine, I should say, in the same. Of course, we use our signature Kadar Coopers, which I'm wearing the best here, the Hungarian oak that we use exclusively. But also I use the same percentage of new oak in each of these. There's 35% new oak, and the rest of it is 2 years used oak. Yeah. Just to kind of keep consistency, so we can see really what the elevation is doing to each one of these wines.
You know, another aspect, talking about the characteristics of the wine, this is a super cool wild part of California. We have, every year we have a lot of bear scat up there. We have a couple bears that come over the fence. For some reason, the bear really likes Petit Verdot. Just anybody's a bear specialist out there, maybe you'll know why. But we have mountain lion, we have bear, we have tons of rattlesnake, and we have a lot of natural native California oily plants around us. So we have manzanita, we have live oak, we have pine. We're right on that pine oak border. And a lot of grapes are incredibly sensitive to picking up those compounds over the course of a whole growing season. And I find, particularly in the upper block, we are surrounded by that forest in the upper bottling that you have there. And it gives this really cool, I love this kind of dried herb character throughout the wine that frankly kind of corresponds with and matches up with some of the tannins. And it's one of the things that I think makes grapes in general, particularly Cabernet, so interesting. It's not just that it's big and it's powerful, but it has all these super cool characteristics all the way through it.
Peter, you remind me that when I'm sampling up there at the vineyard at 6 a.m, I need to be careful. It might be a mountain lion.
I mean, every time the guys come up to start harvesting, and we usually get there around 5:30 in the morning to do. There's a bear always in the staging area because he's picking up all the leftover grapes from the day before picking. So, yeah, be careful out there, Alex.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Folks?
Questions or comments, hopes, dreams?
Or yeah, just thoughts on the wine.
Yeah. While you're thinking, while those are germinating, I will mention that we are looking to do these the third Friday of every month through at least these winter months. I'm certainly open if people have input that they'd like to share in regards to wines that we produce that they would like us to focus on. That's certainly an opportunity to reach out to me. And we'd be happy to consider those for future tastings. And as well as if you have a dinner party or socially distanced group or something that you would like to feature one of us popping in for a short period of time or not for discussion about wines or pairing with whatever meal you're planning, we can help orchestrate that from our end. Just feel free to reach out. And if you are participating in this Zoom and you don't have these wines in front of you, I'm not going to shame you, but I will say that you still can get them. We are not quite out. We have a little bit of it left, and that can be available through our website, or you can email or call us through the tasting room, and we'd be happy to make that happen before it's all gone. I know that Peter mentioned that we had done this previously with the 2009 vintage. And I think that it was extremely popular when it first went out, and then they kind of sat for a while and aged, and then it had a little resurgence as it was fully mature. It really knocked people's socks off. And I think that it's important to note that we are drinking these at what can only be considered the young or the juvenile side of them, and that it will pay dividends to hold on to them. And in 5 to 8 years, revisiting these is going to be a completely new and different experience in terms of what each one of these wines is going to present to you. Whether that's with, hopefully we'll be through this pandemic shenanigans, and that'll be something that you can do in close proximity with friends around a dinner table or organized with a tasting group or whatnot. And so I highly encourage you to consider that. And that is not a sales pitch. That's just one wine geek to another wine geek making assumptions there.
And feel free to drink them right away and order more.
Yeah, we're not gonna twist our rubber arm. We're not gonna hold you accountable for doing that.
Douglas, can I wrap up? I wanted to show you guys one more picture.
Please.
Yeah. Anyway, this was the end of the harvest in 2009. And I took it with my old Nokia phone, if you guys remember Nokia phones and not very good pictures or cameras. We had gotten our hats handed to us at this vintage. And I want to show you a couple things. First, we had really, really dry conditions, almost 5% humidity, like being in the middle of the Utah desert. Then a week later, we got 6 inches of rain. And then a week after that, we had frost. That whole area down there is frosted vines. The fruit's fine, but the grapes, the leaves get frosted. And I remember I took this picture the last day of harvest. I was up there on my truck and I just took a picture and said, we are done. We were cashed. It's a bit of a rodeo to be farming at this elevation on these kinds of soils. I don't want to make it sound too heroic, but you got to be on top of your game. You got to pay attention. Alex's ability to draw out these very fine, really pretty flavors out of this fruit is tough, honestly. And but it's paying attention to the site. It's a super unique place. If you have a chance to come visit us, it's a little remote, not very, but it's beautiful. It's worth the drive. And it's just, I show this picture because this is what it's like. You are a little bit wounded at the end of each harvest a bit, but you make through, and the payoff is to have these wines of quality that we aim for. So thank you for your support of our wines. And by the way, I love seeing some of the Christmas decorations in the background. It's finally good to be at the tail end of 2020. So whoever has those great stockings up, I hope there's some wine in there to be shared. So anyhow, that's it for us, or for me, actually.
Thank you, Peter.
How does the elevation affect the Syrah?
How does elevation affect Syrah?
Our Syrah.
Pretty similar, cooler, kind of a longer season. So not overly ripe. We retain a lot of acid in our Syrah still. So you probably noticed that it's not it's a dense wine, no doubt. but it's not lazy or overly soft in any way. It's really, and even with all of our varietals up there, we're talking about retention of acid because of the cooler climate in the evenings. We get all the ultimate ripeness that we want, really. But then there's plenty of acid there to keep the wines balanced.
We were a group of us from the tasting room and wine club sales team went up to Obsidian Ridge in early mid-October, and we harvested Petit Syrah specifically to make dry Petit Syrah sparkling that you'll want to keep your ear out for. And those small number of rows are just above on the same slope as the Syrah, which is, I mean, you wouldn't imagine it's much of a difference at all. And yet the Petit Syrah was averaging 4 to 6 bricks in as far as sugar measurement, higher than the Petit Syrah at that point. What does that mean? I have absolutely no idea. They're two totally different varietals, but it does mean that what we're looking at on this single slope is an opportunity to produce different wines that are going to express exactly what Mother Nature is giving us each and every year. And there is, as Peter said earlier, it's rough. To predict what she's going to provide us is the first mistake because it's always changing.
So speaking of rough, have you had any impacts from the smoke and fire this year?
Have we had any impacts from the smoke and fire this year? No, none whatsoever. No.
Peter will fill that out.
Yeah, Peter, did you?
Peter is the grower and that first,
Anything you wish to share?
Well, I mean, everybody knows it was an incredibly intense fire year. Super hard for a lot of friends and colleagues. We knew a lot of people who lost houses, lost properties, lost vineyards. It's just, it's tough. I mean, there's no way of getting around it. 2020 was hard for a lot of people. I remember we were talking with some of our distributors on Zoom, like this kind of call in July. And I was like, at least we'll have the harvest. And the rest of the year could be a dog breath of a year, but we'll have a great harvest. And literally a week later, the fires broke out. So there you go. We roll with the punches. There will be smoke effect throughout the North Coast. We're evaluating it. We have a lot of science. We work very closely with a lot of the top laboratories in the world on this. As it turns out, for those of you who know, we have our own cooperage. And the people who are experts in the effect of oak and toasted oak on wine are the same people who are the experts in fire, because they're a lot of the same compounds. So we're tracking it. We're hoping for the best. But it was a tough year. It was a hell of a year across the board. So we'll see what we can do with it.
And certainly didn't affect only us. I mean, my gosh, even from the Central Coast into the Lodi area and up in the
all the way up to
Oregon, Washington,
Yep.
whole West Coast.
A really, sad year for a lot of us, but we're going to try to make the best of it.
Where does the half-mile blend come from this line?
So the question was, where does the half-mile blend come from in regards to this lineup?
Half mile is the Cabernet is selected from, is actually a selection of the best Cabernet of the vintage. I have anywhere from 20 to 28 different lots of Cabernet Sauvignon any given year. And we taste those wines, we select the favorite of the year, and that's what gets selected for half-mile blend. What part of the vineyard is that? It's actually anywhere from the middle to the very top. Some years it's the highest part of the middle, and then some years it's actually the very top.
Excellent. Any other questions? Anything else that we can answer? Any other way we can thank you for your time? Excellent. Well, thank you very much for joining us. Thanks to Alex and Peter for their sharing information. Now take out your number 2 pencil and your Scantron. There will be an exam. Just kidding. Please keep an eye out on your email for upcoming Zooms. Again, as I said, 3rd Friday of each month, we're looking to host these. And Enjoy. Cheers.
Happy holidays.
Thanks,
Happy
everybody.
holidays. Thank you
Take
so
care out
much.
there.